Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to give this a couple of minutes as the attendees start to jump in and join us on this sunny Monday morning to talk about housing economics. Um, my name is Ber Grogan, and I am the new Executive Director here at the Simon Communities of Ireland. So I'm very, very excited for my first Simon Talks. I know there's still some people joining there, so just some housekeeping while people are joining, and we give it a minute or two. There should be a closed caption option for people along the bottom, but this is being recorded and captions will be added to it later on YouTube. There is a Q&A function on the bottom. So if you wish to ask questions during the webinar, that's fine, but we'll take them later during the Q&A section. So we'll have a presentation first, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So if you put questions in the Q&A box during the session, I'll make a note of them and we'll talk about them after the presentation. So I'm just keeping an eye on the attendees. Numbers have gone up there, and just to say a big Gurv Mahagut to Ailish from our office for organising all of this in the background, and for being online and being available. So as I was saying, the Q&A button is there. Enter questions as you think of them, or wait till the end of the presentation. I was having a quick chat with Connor there, and I think we're going to have an interesting chat afterwards as well. We'd love if people got involved with the conversation on social media. So if you could use hashtag Simon Talks, that would be great, because I think we're going to learn a lot. Well, I'm certainly going to learn a lot this morning. So for those of you joining, I was just introducing myself as the new Executive Director of Simon Communities of Ireland. This is the start of week 6 for me, so I'm very, very excited to be here. So our focus of my first hashtag Simon Talks is economic and housing market outlook. And joining us today is Conor O'Toole. It's not his first Simon Talks, so and he's back by popular demand. The people ask for you, Conor, so that's why we've asked you to come back and to reschedule this. So Conor O'Toole is an associate research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute, so the ESRI, where he works in the areas of housing and household financing, corporate finance, and banking. He also works with the ESRI's macroeconomic forecasting group as a contributing author to the quarterly economic commentary. He previously held the position of manager in Real Financial Linkages team and senior economist at the Financial Stability Division of the Central Bank of Ireland. His research has been published in a range of international journals, including the Review of Finance, Journal of Corporate Finance, Journal of Banking and Finance, and the Journal of Housing Economics. So I'm already learning things about journals that I hadn't heard of before. Economics would not be my forte, Conor. So I'm really, really looking forward to this. And I'm going to be quiet, and I'll see you after the presentation for the Q&A. Thanks so much, Conor.
Thanks, Emil Burr. And at the outset, just to say thanks to Simon and the team there for the invitation. This is my third Simon Talks. I'm very happy to be able to come back and give our perspective on the macroeconomic and housing outlook. Typically, we've done this in the start of January every year to give a good kind of lens into what's happening for the coming year. But actually having waited a little bit, unfortunately, had to defer the first time, probably made a lot of sense given the incoming US administration in January have really shook the tires on the international economy, and I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that for Ireland. So, what am I hoping to cover today? So, look, the Ireland is a really small, really open economy, and the international developments, the rising uncertainty, the international geopolitical fragmentation, the introduction of tariffs by the US administration and potential retaliation, all of this is clouding the international outlook, and that is a major headwind for the Irish economy. Why does that matter when we're very interested in housing? Well, it matters for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the international component of the economy provides a huge amount of tax revenues that the government recycles into activities in the housing market, that be it the provision of all the social supports in the housing sector, but also the public funds for the investment activities in housing. So it really matters what cash we have available to invest. So we need to understand the context and think about the threats. So I'm going to talk first about just the Irish economy in general. One of the things that we've been starting to think about more recently and trying to position this when we're communicating about the economy is just looking simply at how we're structured and how vulnerable we are and why that matters. And then I'll talk a little bit about the outlook and the potential risks. And then I'm going to delve into a couple of housing market topics. Now, as I was saying to Bear earlier, I'm happy to take questions on any aspects of the housing market, but the two I'm going to focus in on are one, the sluggish supply activity, and second of all, the regulatory structures around the private rental market, and in particular the issue of rent control. So I will talk about both of those in the presentation. Okay, so let me talk about the macroeconomy. Ireland is a very small economy globally. It's very open to international trade. It's very fast growing recently. It is the envy of many economies across Europe. But that growth has been extremely volatile, and a huge amount of that activity has been driven by the multinational sector. Within that sector, I'm going to show you a couple of charts on this now in a second. The activity is really dominated by two particular subsectors. That's pharmaceuticals and computer services. They make up nearly half of our exports. They make up a huge component of our output, and they are, thankfully, and on the risk side, they make up a huge component of our corporation tax, which I will talk about in more detail. So these sectors matter, and they matter not just for the persons employed in that, but for the amount of resources that provides the economy to do other things. So the developments there are key. One of the things that we need to think about then, given those particular subsectors, is how may the international headwinds, and we can see them coming down the tracks, how are they likely to materialize into impacts on the ground here? And that is the key issue, and that's how we need to tease it. So I will be talking a little bit about that as well. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to just start really big picture. I think this is always a good way to keep in our minds, what is happening with the structure of the Irish economy. This chart just looks at what we produce in GDP volume terms. So if you take all of the output that's produced in the Irish economy, break it up by subsector, what is it we produce? Well, the interesting thing here is if you look at manufacturing, which that includes the pharmaceutical activities, and you look at ICT, which is the red and green here, that makes up half of all our output. And then you think of other sectors that we know are important and we can kind of relate to, things like wholesale and retail, things like financial services, the construction sector. These are all small components compared to the other two huge output sectors, which are ICT and manufacturing. So we have a highly concentrated economy in these two particular subsectors. And where do people work? That's even more interesting. So we know half the output is in two particular subsectors, but our employment base is more diversified than that. Okay, so we get in terms of the multinational activity, there's a lot more output happens in those two particular subsectors than there is employment. So you can see manufacturing output here, or manufacturing employment here is about 13% of total employment. ICT is about 6%, but they were 30% and 20% of output respectively. So what does that mean? Well, the activity that the Irish economy produces is highly concentrated in these two subsectors. But in terms of an employment base, they are important, but they are not as important. And that's because of the activities of some very small number of really big firms that bring production into Ireland, and that creates that concentration risk that we know we face. So not to say that this hasn't been a positive. FDI has been a wonderful transformative tool for the Irish economy. It really has pulled us from, you look through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it has pulled us from a very rural, very agrarian economy to one of the world's most productive economies. But we need to understand within that the employment base and the output, the production side are not fully mapped. So when we bring those two things together, so you've got output, how much do we make, and how many people work there. Well, if we put those two together, that kind of gives us an idea of how much activity does each employee create. So that's kind of productivity. That's when economists talk about productivity, and particular labor productivity. What do they mean by that? Well, they're thinking, how much output does each individual worker produce typically? And what you can very clearly see, these are the output per worker by sector, also broken down here on the x-axis by the ownership of the companies. We can see the activity is really productive in those foreign firms, in those particular subsectors, and everything else is relatively flat and kind of in line. Don't have it here, but relatively in line with other European countries. So highly concentrated, that brings risks. Those risks are heightening all the time in the current geopolitical environment. Yeah, this just reinforces that on the export side, and we looked at total output. But what happens with that? Well, pharma, computer services, all of that activity is exported, so it's not purchased by Irish consumers. That's really good because we earn those revenues back into the economy, but it does put us at a huge risk of of a downturn internationally, or even a sector-specific downturn internationally, passing through to the domestic economy. How has this happened? Look, and how quickly has this happened? Well, actually, the dominance of multinationals is a relatively recent phenomenon. You can see the chart on the left-hand side looks at the gross value added, so how much is produced by foreign and domestic firms. Foreign in the blue, domestic in the red. You can actually see the foreign sectors, their output really ramped up since 2013. So that's really recent in terms of our long-term history, that they've come to about 50% of our overall economic output. So this has literally happened since the financial crisis, not overnight, but in a relatively short space of time. These two areas have come to dominate our economy. So in some ways, it's wonderful because we've got all this tax revenue from it, but it's extremely risky because we haven't seen yet a major downturn with this type of sectoral concentration in the economy. Okay, so where does that lead us? That's our overall economic structure. Okay, so we know we're dominated by a small number of really big firms in particular subsectors, and that leaves us extremely vulnerable to those international developments. And not only broad international developments in those two subsectors can have very large repercussions on Ireland. And where does that leave us? Well, that's what we try and tease out in our quarterly commentary. We produce it in March, June, September, December of every year. Unfortunately for this particular talk, we're a few weeks early on the March 2025 one, but I'll try and give you a flavour for the direction of travel that we see things going. So at the end of last year, when we set our last forecasts, we kind of had this really dual aspect to the economy. So the domestic economy was registering strong growth. Okay, so obviously the modified domestic demand indicator, which is our key one that we use to measure what happens here, and it strips out some of the investment by the multinationals. It was growing very strongly, 3% last year, and we expected it to tip up to 4% this year. That was happening with an economy nearly at full employment. The labour market was performing extremely well. Incomes were rising, households were spending, so the domestic economy was doing reasonably well. However, the multinational side, particularly the exports, while it was growing and rebounded somewhat throughout 2024, there is where the major risks on the downside are associated with the US policy changes, in particular around the tariffs and the investment uncertainty. What are those particular channels? What do they really look like? Well, obviously the tariffs can have a direct impact. They're put on Irish exports to the US. That raises the price of those, and that will impact the flows. Also, obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty around investment that can materialize in just lower flows now. So companies in those sectors that export into the US or even just rely on world trade, very reluctant now to make large commitments of capital until they see what the new trading environment will look like. So that has a major impact on our broader growth outlook. And again, we know the knock-on impact that can have for the public finances because general government balance about 2% last year without the Apple payment. Add that in, huge amount of these revenues coming from corporation tax. Those flows wane, and then we could be turning a deficit in quite short order. So major risks around the potential for those FDI related sectors to knock on to the public finances. Always a nice chart to look at this. This looks at the growth rate of the foreign and domestic oriented sectors. You can see the blue dashed line. That is the domestic sectors. Very stable, growing relatively solidly, and then you have that huge fluctuations in the multinational activities, and that's really around in particular exports on the pharma side, and also some of the computer services activity. Okay, domestic spending. So that's obviously one of the best lenses we have into what's happening here on the ground in Ireland. Household spending is, it is unaffected by the multinational activities in the national accounts. It's driven by real wage increases. So what matters for it is income rises, inflation, and people's perceptions of savings. So do they feel they need to save, or do they spend? Consumption was relatively okay last year. Just expectation at the end of the year was around 2.6% for the full year for 24, and expecting it to grow a little bit this year by incomes rising, inflation coming down a little bit. That should give a kick to consumption. So with that modified domestic demand and the consumption activity, previous forecasts were expecting the domestic economy to perform reasonably well. I think in terms of the direction of travel, obviously we'll be revisiting these forecasts. The risks are increasing and the outlook is clouding, and that could affect a number of channels through which consumption could be impacted. One would be if inflation is higher for longer, that would reduce the growth in real wages. For example, if energy prices to rise again. And furthermore, if the labor market was to deteriorate, that could impact the income side, as well as households maybe increasing precautionary savings. So a lot of uncertainty around elements of these channels going into 25 and 26. Investment, I'll talk a little bit about this in the housing side, but it's been very volatile. You can see the chart here. The building construction actually has been turning down the past couple of quarters. That is a major challenge given the infrastructural constraints that we know we face in the housing side, on the broader infrastructure side. So that is a worrying trend. And we know we only got in around 30,000 housing units last year when we expected more. So investment is sluggish on the residential side in particular, and the non-resi hasn't recovered from its previous downturn. You can see the orange bar on this chart is the modified non-construction. So that is taking out the distortionary elements, gives a lens into what's happening on businesses. That picked up a little bit, but I think that is likely to moderate with the uncertainty. Yeah, I think construction investment is, I'm going to come back to this in the housing side, but again, weaker than we need it to be given the capacity constraints in the domestic economy. On the international trade side, I've kind of talked a little bit about that before, so I don't want to labor this point too much. But all of the risks are really on the downside with the trade, given the Trump tariffs and its knock-on impacts for global trade. Ireland is extremely exposed. We know it's extremely exposed in the particular subsectors like pharma, and we are likely to have to revise downwards our trade forecasts for 25 and into 26 on the back of that. I think this is always a nice chart to look at it. It looks at our direct dependence on the US. So what proportion of our merchandise trade exports go to the US? And in total, it's about 30%. So it's a big chunk of trade. But for pharma, it's even bigger. It's up to 40% of trade in 24. So very heightened reliance on the US, in particular in that very important subsector. Yeah, well, one of the things we were trying to do prior to the winter commentary was get an understanding of what the tariffs that the US is proposing, what they might mean for the global economy. And the IMF did a piece in October, which actually looks very benign now and quite out of date in the sense of the scale of the tariffs. But the type of channels they were looking at were lower global trade, tighter financial conditions, lower migration, all of this knocking, percentage point or greater from the global economy, and that is likely to pass through to Ireland. And given our sectoral concentration, it's likely to be a greater than 1-to-1 pass through for some of those activities. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of domestic indicators. Then I'm going to start talking about the housing side. So obviously the cost of living crisis has been hugely impactful for many households in Ireland. The prices have risen at rates we haven't seen in many years, particularly in 2021, 22, 23. Those price rises were extremely high and extremely impactful for people's living standards. Thankfully, last year, we did see a moderation in price growth, not the price level, but the price growth. Why was that? In particular, the energy price increases were starting to come down. Those major spikes following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those global energy shocks, they started to moderate, and prices were beginning to decrease. You can see top chart here looks at the period from January 23 up to the most present data we have available, which is January of 25. You can see a fall off all the way through towards the end of last year in the overall inflation rate for Ireland. But what's notable is that pickup at the end of the period. So that little pickup in the most recent data, and that's likely to be coming through some of those domestic capacity constraints. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the chart below, that splits that inflation rate out by where that inflation is coming from. So you can see, if we go back to 2023, the green bar, that's the contribution to inflation. That was housing and energy, so that's where a lot of the inflation was coming from. But that has switched. Now you can see things like restaurants and hotels, so the domestic sectors starting to lead to those price increases, transport in 25, and also recreation. So these domestic activities, which are impactful on prices, are starting to feed through again. So we need to keep an eye on this, because this is one thing we do not want is any return for inflationary pressures. What does that mean? Well, when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about in an economy at capacity like we are, so a very tight labor market. If we have too much spending in too short a period, that is likely to lead through to price increases. And we will see that most in domestic-oriented activities like hotels and restaurants, like recreation, like the domestically non-traded activities, where they don't have that international component. So what about this year? Well, our forecast at the end of last year was for a continued moderation in inflation, but that slight spike we've seen towards the start of this year and the likelihood for tariffs to come in and be impactful on the global market may put at risk that disinflationary pattern, and we may need to revise our forecasts for prices. The labour market, that is a source of huge strength for the Irish economy. You can see the forecasts we put out before Christmas for the labour market. We are operating at just over 4%. That is full employment. There is little to no spare capacity in the labour market. What does that mean? Well, it means that extra expenditure, extra activity is likely to pass through to price inflation because we do not have the capacity to raise employment through spare labour. That also is considerably impactful on our ability to deal with capacity constraints. We know we're in an economy which has major capacity constraints in housing and infrastructure, in kind of water, wastewater, all of these that require labour to deal with these. We do not have a huge amount of labour available to do it, and that's a constraint. But this market is a source of strength in terms of the Irish economy. What about the public finances? Well, look, we are, on the face of it, we are running surpluses. We have considerable amount of resources available, but when we look under the bonnet, there's an awful lot of risk associated with those increases, in particular the corporation tax. You can see the contribution of corporation tax to the overall exchequer receipts here, the green bar just going up and up and up. So we are getting these receipts in, but there are risks associated with that, and we need to be very careful about how we manage that, particularly in an economy at full capacity, and make sure we don't tie those receipts to day-to-day expenditure, to target them towards investment in capacity where we can, but we need to be careful about how we spend those. And in particular, when you think about some of the longer term threats that could face Ireland, you're thinking about the aging of the population, some of the ticking time bombs around pensions. We need to put some of this money away to have resources in the future. So that's a key element. I always like to put this chart up, looks at the concentration of the corporation tax and its proportion of the overall tax take. Again, we highlight this a lot today. Here comes ICT and pharma again. We're talking about nearly 50% of corporation tax from those two sectors alone, and up to nearly 30% of the total tax take. So again, these are highly concentrated receipts. Okay, so let me just talk for a few minutes before I finish on the housing market. So I think, given that outlook, I always like to do the broader outlook first, and I do that deliberately because it contextualizes everything we need to do on the housing market side. So we have, if you think back to the slides I've just talked through, we have labour market at full capacity. We have inflation coming down, but potentially at risk. We have lots of fiscal resources, but they're coming. They're highly concentrated, and their long-term sustainability is in question. So what does that mean for the housing market? Well, we know we have a major undersupply of housing. That's something we think we can all agree on at this stage, and we need to think about targeting the resources as best we possibly can. In terms of the discussion, going to touch on two things which I think are important and currently topical, but I'm happy to take questions on other aspects that people might wish to touch upon. The first thing is the supply constraints and completions. So there's been an awful lot of work done from various sources. Colleagues in the SRI, the Housing Commission and elsewhere have all done predictions of how many housing units we need. It's very clear if you look at all of those, we're somewhere between 50 and 60,000 units at a minimum that we need to stand still over time. Why do we need that? We need to deal with population growth. We need to deal with the pent-up demand. So all of this is putting major pressure on the supply side. And it's just not really meeting that. We got 30,000 units last year, which is way short of what we needed. What is the outlook looking like? Well, it's not great for this year, okay? One of the leading indicators we've often used for the completions is commencements. So typically, a house will be commenced 9 to 15 months prior and then would turn into a completion. So that gave us historically a wonderful forecasting tool to think about completions. But that relationship has broken down in particular since the pandemic, when all these lags between when commencement started and when activity happened and the like, it's made it much more difficult to pass that relationship through. But on that, let me talk about commencements, because I think it's a good place to start this discussion. So we can see we were having around 30,000 commencements a year, 21, 22, and 23. We had a major increase in commencements last year, up just under 70,000. What happened there? Well, actually, what's really interesting is that part of that is to do with changes in policy. So obviously there was the development levy waiver and other policy changes, which are likely to have brought forward to those pinch points commencements that would have happened maybe at other points in time. So this doesn't necessarily mean that these commencements are going to map through in that traditional forecasting fashion into completions within a 9 to 15 month time frame. They are likely to turn into completions, but under what time frame, there's a lot more uncertainty than that would typically be. So you can see the chart on the right hand side looks at the monthly profile of completions, commencements. You can see what happened comparing 24 in blue to 23 and 22. We had these major spikes at the pinch points when the policies changes were about to be implemented, and then drops down, whereas much smoother for the other years. So this kind of typical, much less spikes in those patterns. So that what makes me a bit wary about passing through these into the completions data. Yeah, I think one of the things we need to think about in Ireland is what's happening with housing completions, and what is potentially acting as a constraint on this. One of the things, I was involved in a UNECE report which looked at housing affordability across a number of different countries, and actually one of the amazing things there for me when you look outside Ireland, because we get bogged down in our own context here, and what happens is many of these challenges that we're facing are global in nature. They're happening in many other countries. So the chart on the left-hand side here looks at housing completions per 1,000 adults of the population, and it takes Ireland in green and a basket of other countries, the mean and median for those. You can see actually Ireland is performing relatively okay in current cross-country comparison with those other basket of countries. Whereas if you look at the right-hand side chart, what that shows is if you go way back for Ireland and the number of housing connections per 1,000 persons in household forming age between 20 and 50, all the way back to the 1980s, we are producing a lot less housing per person than we used to be. So even though we're kind of up there with other countries, everybody's lower than they typically would need to be in a cross-country context. So this is not just an Irish issue. So what's happening? Well, there's a range of different issues, and some of them highlighted in that UN report. The cost pressures, the changes in the environmental requirements, the project timelines that go with new production these days, how housing finance has changed, and all the developments around labor costs and material costs. All of this have made supply much more difficult than it used to be. And when we look at planning permissions in Ireland, it's not trending upwards, and that is not a good sign for our outlook for commencements and completions. From this perspective, what should we really be focusing on? Well, in a sense, to try and unlock supply, we need to deal with the supply side. Okay, it's all about trying to deal with the supply side. So trying to deal with the infrastructure gap around water, wastewater, those policies that are targeted about unlocking infrastructure around sites, making those land markets more efficient through the planning system, and activities like the LDA do. They're the type of policies that can help to try and deal with some of these global challenges, these cross-country challenges that have been identified and that are operating here on the supply side in Ireland, that are making it more difficult for us to get housing units developed. Okay, so the final topic, I've got about 5 minutes before I'm going to stop. So I thought I would touch on the rental sector. So this is, it's been in sharp focus in recent periods. There's been a lot of discussion around the impacts of the RPZs. What do rent controls do? If they're to be replaced, what should they be replaced with? And what role should they play in the future? Well, this is something we've actually done quite a bit on in the ESRI. We did a big report in 2022 on rent stabilization measures, which looked at nearly all of these topics and put forward various perspectives and policy options here. I think one of the things to remember about the rental sector is that it is becoming more and more important over time. There are fewer homeowners. You can see this chart goes back to 1991, looks at the proportion of households in different tenures. Outright ownership is dropping. And the red here, which is the private rental sector, that is rising. And it is, so therefore, these issues are impacting more and more people over time. And when you think about where some of the sectoral developments are going to happen, think about expanding cost rental, think about more social housing, social rental. These are going to lead to an increase over time in the overall level of rental activity in Ireland. So this does matter, and it matters in a big way. But what's happening behind this chart, I always like to put this up there because it really puts it in context. When you look at home ownership by age, okay, this is from a report that colleagues in the ESRI did. It looks at since 1987, how many people in different age brackets at that point in time owned their home. So you can see older people in general, very high home ownership rates that are plus 65 and over 45, very high home ownership rates. We see those two bottom lines, the 25 to 34 and the 35 to 44. They're the areas where there's been a big drop off in home ownership over time. So this is young people who aren't moving into home ownership, and we need to think about what's the optimal housing market picture for these type of households over time. Okay, so let me talk about rent controls. So rent controls are, from an economics perspective, these are one of the simplest policies to understand what the impacts are going to be, because they have been deployed in multiple markets in multiple timeframes, and there are literally hundreds of studies that have looked at these. The type of caps, I think that are in each market matters. So there's a typology that's used in the academic literature about what type of caps there are. They have these first, second, and third generation controls. What that really means is, do you cap the rent level or do you cap the inflation rate? Okay, so the second generation caps the inflation rate. The first generation used to cap the level. So that was kind of what happened after the Second World War. And then Ireland has a kind of hybrid version of the second generation where you target rent controls in rapid inflation, low affordability areas. These are the kind of rent stabilization measures. But if we look across these, it is relatively straightforward to characterize what the findings have been of these rent controls over time. For the major benefit of this, and this is seen across multiple studies and is seen in Ireland, is it provides affordability protections to existing tenants. So the inflation rate on the rents and or the level of rents is lower than it otherwise would have been for those in existing tenancies. The drawback, and this is shown in multiple studies for Ireland and many of the other countries, is that it has very strong knock-on impacts on the supply side. It often leads to market exits by landlords, it reduces new investment, and it can reduce the maintenance and upkeep of existing properties. And the choice between those two is a trade-off. And it's a political trade-off. You have to decide, in a sense, the degree to which you set your rent controls has to trade off those two things, because they are you cannot necessarily have both of those operating at the same time. You cannot always there will be a trade-off between the tightness that protects existing tenants and the impacts on the supply side. There are other impacts too. Often in these rent controls, where you've got very strict rent controls, you will have existing new tenants find it very difficult to find new properties because the supply is down. So the existing tenants do okay, but prospective new tenants often don't. You know, you can see this is just a characterization of where what happens in other countries. Majority use third generation, which means you're allowed to reset it between tenancies, and few use the stricter measures these days. Yeah, I think not gonna dwell on this too much, because anyone who's interested can look at our report, which kind of lays this out in very clear measures. And it's not just our report, there are multiple reports. There's a really nice paper by Professor Ken Gibb from Uni Glasgow who looked at this as well. And again, all of the very typical effects you would have with these type of price ceilings, they materialize in multiple markets over time and across country. Yeah, this just kind of reiterates some of those conventional cases against rent control. It's made in multiple markets. What does it do? Reduces household formation, can impact labor market mobility, and impacts on the supply side, but it does protect existing tenants. So what matters? Okay, so we know that's the evidence. How do we think about what we should do for Ireland? Well, my view on this is the devil is really in the details. So the calibration matters. The kind of policy choices that we will face in this area are: how do we design a system that balances between the supply side effects and the protections for existing tenants? The options that we have are to have an inflation cap like we have. Do we change the geographic scope of that? Does it go for all Ireland, or does it stay with the targeted approach like it has now? Do we allow resets between tenancies, and how do we cap the inflation rate at a within tenancy level? And how do we deal with issues around in enforcement? Now, I know the Housing Commission has come out in favour of reference rents. That is just one possible option. I'm not so convinced that that may be the optimal approach. There are downsides to reference rents. A very considerable calculation challenge. It is, in a sense, just you know, in inflation cap, you've got to work out how many different rents you set. It doesn't necessarily unlock the challenges that we face in a clear manner. So it is just one option, in my view, across a range of options that we face. Okay, so let me. I've talked probably a little bit more than I said I would, so apologies, Burr and team there. Let me just sum up. Ireland faces major headwinds internationally. The outlook is darkening on the international economy because of the changes on the US administration and their view on how to deal with global trade, and that is going to have knock-on impacts for Ireland. And question for us is, how do we deal with that in an economy with major infrastructure challenges and continue to be able to provide households with the living standards that they're accustomed to, and deal with issues around housing and healthcare, etc. So with that, I'll stop. I'll say thanks for listening, and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Connor. I was busy taking notes, and yeah, I have some questions if we have time, but I see that two questions have come in. So if it's okay, we're going to go to these
Sure.
first. So Matthew has asked, so it's twofold. Does a set rate of HAP, so I know we spoke about this before coming online, the housing assistance payment. So does a set rate of HAP raise, oh, where's it gone? Raise rent as a market rate signaler, and would moving HAP rates to a percentage of income rather than a set rate of payment help to reduce rent?
They're tricky questions to answer, like because they're couched within a broader context of how do you design your subsidization policy for rents more generally. So obviously, the conversation Bear was alluding to there as we were just talking about the impact of HAP on the affordability for households. Research colleagues of mine have done in the SRI has shown that actually HAP has helped hugely in terms of providing an affordability benefit for the recipient households. Um, and those uh, but those households are in private rental sector accommodation and they are qualifying for social housing. My main view on that is the challenge we face really is we're trying to get the private rental sector to do the job where we just need more social housing and more cost rental and more alternative to private rental sector housing. And if we had a sufficient stock of these other housing types and we're able to transition households from HAP, from those subsidies, into longer term options which are more suitable for them, then we would have less focus and less friction around how we dealt with with the private rental sector in general, because we are just having the wrong type of households in that sector to begin with. So to come back to the question on what about the HAP rates, I think subsidies are really tricky to do. You've got different impacts of subsidies. You got to decide what are they for, right? So are they to provide a target on income, a support system on income, or are they to cover housing cost? So for many households, these subsidies, they're in a sense, income top-ups on their recipient payments to allow them to have a standard of living. And I think that's a good way to think about them. So you're in a sense saying to these households, we want to target particular standard of living, and we set those rates relative to income. Well, you think about what actually happens is that in the middle of all that are the differential rents, right? That's the rent the tenant actually pays. They're a payment on an income-based, very low payment relative to income, and then that top up provides the difference. So very tricky. In a sense, the Housing Commission had work on this that I think is really well thought out. In a sense, we need to move because one of the impacts of differential rents is that, particularly for local authorities, it doesn't give them sufficient income flows to maintain the buildings, to keep those, to invest in the energy efficiency of those buildings, and they have to use other funds for that. So in a sense, what would be the best thing to do would be to move away from differential rents, have a set of economic rents that are charged, but subsidize everybody so that there's no impact on the household in terms of the payment that they need to make or the cost to those households. So that'd be the overall point.
Okay. We've a couple of more questions here that I'm going to jump through, Connor, if that's okay. So Felix is saying about given full employment and the need to increase to 60,000 minimum house completions each year, what practical steps can be taken now to increase the labour and skills supply that's clearly required? And maybe that's outside the scope of.
Felix always asks hard questions. I know for many years. Look, I think it's really tricky in the short run, because those constraints are now. I think we need to try and attract talent into the economy, which has these skills, but also we need to invest in more apprenticeships. We need to try and encourage people into these sectors, and that comes through the school system. So that'll mean education policy. That'll mean targeting early interventions in the system to encourage people into the construction sector over time, because we're going to need that capacity. and we're going to need for very many years. But in a sense, one of the things that we, in the short run, we maybe need to try and reorientate resources into the residential sector, away from other sectors if we can in the very short run. But these are really tricky questions in the long term.
Yeah, and I suppose I'd be thinking as well as we need to have affordable housing or private rental system for people to live, as well if they're going to be working in the sector. So Karen, our brilliant Galway Simon CEO, has asked, how can we optimally increase supply of housing in the context of resource constraints and the headwinds identified?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that there, one of the things, I think you break it down, you think about what are the frictions that are inhibiting housing supply. And there are multiple. I mentioned a couple of them there. The cost of production is really high, and it's high globally. It's not just in Ireland, and that's there's major changes around what constitutes good housing or sufficient housing now in terms of the environmental requirements for that housing. So how do we make change? What can we control, right? The planning system is one. It is a major bottleneck. The new Planning Act may help, but the timelines associated with planning decisions in Ireland really just constrain everything. And to me, that's something we can control and we can make changes with. The land market, we're big fans of the residential zoned land tax. That has to come in, keep that land into the system, make it work harder, make it come through the system quicker. And I think funds like the LIHAF, like those targeted at the supporting infrastructure that helps unlock sites, I think are well targeted type of activities.
Brilliant. And Rebecca then, who was with Simon Communities of Ireland, you might have met her previously. Any comments on the need to diversify financing for social housing provided by approved housing bodies, particularly as we may face a hit to our public finances? And any comments on the need to move AHBs off balance sheet? And thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, like I'm not an expert in AHB financing now. But I think it's very clear, just alluded to there, the role of social housing, be it by AHBs, be it by local authorities, probably both over time, is going to have to increase. We're going to need a bigger proportion over time of that particular tenure. And that's going to have to be financed in a sustainable manner. So that will require financing that's not just public. So we will need to find financing mechanisms that are sustainable, that can target funds into the sector, but that also ensure that the stock of housing that is invested in particular that's invested in by the public funds, will remain social housing and remain in that sector for that particular tenure type. So look, I think diversifying the financing structure makes sense. The Exchequer can't do everything, can't be asked to do everything, and won't be able to do everything. So, but it will need to do a lot. So I think we'll have to bring in European financing, leverage as much as we can, funds through the European Investment Bank, etc. I know they're getting moving on housing. It's becoming a much bigger issue for the European Commission for the first time. So we need to be front and center to that and make sure that there are no easy wins that we could get involved in that would help us unlock the financing needed to deliver in that tenure that we need a lot more housing.
And I think this question from Haley then might link in with that. And I know you said there are global challenges, but are there any countries that maintain their housing supply even in times of economic downturn? So, our delivery tends to be pro-cyclical, which is very problematic post 2008. During these times, there may be more people available to continue with building.
Yeah, I think it's tricky to pick out a country that has that pro-cyclicality was the only reason that it had its housing system is more stable than ours. So there are a multitude of reasons. Pro-cyclicality is just one. If you think about where the stable rental section, we talk a lot about Austria, right? But Finland is another really good example. These countries have just kind of targeted a more stable level of low income renting to to housing stock than we have over time, and have made sure that a cornerstone of that has been public support in various guises for that tenure. So I think we need to ensure that the next shock that comes, there's many out there that could materialize, that we are clear in our vision that there is a component of the housing market that will require public support over time for low-income households and low-income households in particular in the rental sector, that the market is not going to provide housing for, and that we need to just provide a stable set of housing units for that component of the population over time.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have a couple of minutes left, so it's okay. I'm gonna keep you because there were a few things that were coming into my head as you were chatting, and I don't know. You probably saw that the Central Statistics Office are doing a set of kind of consultations around housing data sets and what we should be looking at and what would be more helpful. And I was really interested to see the huge number of commencements in 2024. But as you said, you're wary to assume, when they might become completions. It's something that's really difficult for us working in the housing and homeless sector to know and understand the transparency around data. So if you could pick an ideal kind of data set that we should be asking for or saying to the CSO, this is something we should be working towards. It used to be connections as well, didn't it? It was if you were connected to ESB. So what do you think we should be asking for?
Yeah, like the CSO have access to great data, relative to what they had in the past. The administrative sources of data have got an awful lot better. A couple of things I think are worth pointing out that maybe get lost sometimes. For example, if you take a look at the RTB registrations data set, that data set there are very few other examples of a data set like that internationally that is used and can be help to provide evidence for policy making. The question is, how can you link these up? You want to try and link these to other data sets so you can get a better picture. You want to have like, if you could ideally look at all the housing stock in Ireland, where does it go? What tenure is it in? When did it come into the system? Be able to map and follow these housing connections over time across different data sets. That's really where you get value added. But then over and above that, the data is just one thing. We can have all the data we want, but if we don't make good inference from it, if we don't use it to inform policies and not get drawn in by anecdotes and anecdata, as we like to call it, one or two stories that people have, and actually help let that data inform your policy decisions or your suite of options that you pick. That's where you get value added from these data sets. They're no use on their own. Sit in vaults, they don't do anything. How they're used is what matters.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, particularly with all of the debate around the rent pressure zones that we've had lately. And I know, again, a frustrating piece for me was seeing the headlines about, mass exodus of landlords from the sector. And then the RTB had their quarterly report launched just at the end of last week, which was really interesting. I'd encourage as well anyone online to go and have a look at the report that shows that overall the number of landlords is actually increasing. And I know they tend to be larger landlords, but I do think it's just something that in the kind of the wider societal narrative, that sometimes the evidence and the data and the facts can get lost in that. And just before that we finish up, I obviously have to acknowledge that, the private rental sector is a large reason that people end up experiencing homelessness. Maybe sometimes it's just for a short while. And just on that, and Karen was here, but there's been an increase in people over 60 and over 65 contacting Simon communities across the country for the first time in their lives, because of the rental sector and unaffordable rent. And when you showed the graphs about the home ownership drop off by age, I do think that's something that will need to be considered by policymakers, that kind of safety net of owning your own home when you retire or you reach pension age isn't there anymore for a lot of people, and that's just going to get worse as we move on. And then the last thing was when I worked in the Dáil, I just remember the Oireachtas were absolutely allergic to the term rent controls, which is why we've been trying to use kind of rent regulations, but really interested to look more into what you were saying about rent references, reference rents. And I think ideally, you know, I'd love a rent freeze for the moment, until we get everything sorted, so there's less people entering homelessness.
But those policies are not costless. You have a rent freeze, they have impacts, right? And that, I think that's what we need to remember. You have to trade off everything. So you have a rent freeze, but that will have an impact. And
Yeah,
I think that's what sometimes gets lost, that trade-off could impact your outlook for how many units you need or how many, extra supply you get. So these are not isolated choices. They all have
absolutely.
trade-offs. And
Yeah,
one
and
thing I will on the older renters, we actually did a report for the Pensions Council a number of years ago, which looked at that, actually tried to simulate what would happen to the at-risk of poverty rate for older households, because they're now going to be at risk. They're in a rental tenure. When they face that income cliff at retirement, they no longer have that house, their mortgage payment doesn't drop with it. They now
yeah.
still have a housing payment. And actually you can see there's a big challenge going to be there that we've never had before. So yeah, I think that's going to need support over time.
Brilliant. And I'd love to speak to you offline then as well. I think around the cost benefit analysis piece, as you say, you know, there is always knock-on effects or impacts, but if investment was put into preventing people experiencing homelessness or entering homelessness, I do think that, you know, there would be a much longer term economic return to the exchequer. So I know we've gone over time, 2 minutes over, but absolutely fascinating. Slides will be circulated. The recording will be put up online. Huge thank you to Conor and to everyone for joining us this morning. And again, a big thank you to Ailish in the background. So Conor, an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Take care, everyone. Bye bye.